will show up. Awesome. Got it. Okay, meeting is being recorded. Yes, indeed. Okay. All right. So Kathryn, say something so you pop into the view there.
Good evening, good morning, good afternoon.
Perfect. That is awesome. So you just saved me about 10 seconds. I'll just go dot, 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 wherever you are in the world. Okay. Thank you all for joining us today for our monthly Globinar Export Import Forum for the Global Chamber. I'm the moderator, Anita Rodal, president of SBPI Services. Based in Southern California, I connect importers and global enterprises to the currency exchange company that best fits their needs for their cross-border payments. For US-based businesses, I also broker SBA loans, equipment financing, as well as payable financing for importers and wholesalers. So reach out if you have needs. I am, however, very, very proud to be a member of the advisory board for the Los Angeles chapter of the Global Chamber. And the Global Chamber, in case anybody isn't aware, is a collaborative community of CEOs, executives, and business leaders in over 525 metro regions around the world. So, whether this is your first or 50th Global Chamber webinar, it's important to remember that the Chamber's mission is to foster sorry, that's the brain, the cold hitting my brain, cross-border business, trade, and investment in every region of the world by providing its members with warm introductions, valuable connections, and timely information. So during the webinar, I invite you to put your contact information in the chat. Please include your full name, first and last. It makes it much easier for people to find you on LinkedIn in case you're not putting your LinkedIn link in there. And remember to save the chat so you have all that information for everybody else. So let me tell you how today's forum will work. In the first 40 to 45 minutes, I'll be interviewing our guest expert. And in the last 10 to 15 minutes, we'll open it up for Q&A and conversation. And again, please keep yourselves muted for the first part of the program. So today we are very, very lucky to have the amazing Kathryn Reed with us for the Globinar. So I'll tell you a little bit about Kathryn. Kathryn is an international sales and marketing consultant with over 25 years experience developing niche products in emerging markets. She helps small and medium-sized companies break through international barriers, creating successful entrepreneurs and a thriving global marketplace. Originally from the UK, Kathryn resides in Upper Austria. She has a bachelor's degree in French and German and is a graduate member of the world-renowned Institute of Export. Kathryn firmly believes that business is done between people and therefore places her focus on building strong relationships that form a solid foundation for doing business. When she's not traveling around the world, Kathryn enjoys playing the clarinet in her town's wind orchestra or sharing her love of the outdoors with her scout group. So, welcome, Kathryn.
Thank you for inviting me. It's a real pleasure to be here tonight.
You are very welcome. Okay, so we have a bunch of questions for you, and we're going to try and keep everything going in schedule so that we have time at the end. So if I need to rush, I'll let you know, and if not, we'll just stick to what we got. So my
Yeah,
first question for you is this. What are the biggest differences between exporting to Europe and exporting to Asia that companies often overlook? And does this assume that they are based in the EU, or do these differences hold true regardless of where you're exporting from?
I think probably the main differences are the cultural ones, if you're talking about the European Union or if you're talking about Europe versus Asia. And especially, of course, companies have to remember that the EU, from a regulatory perspective, is like one trading bloc with one set of standardized regulations. But each member state has the right to actually have separate laws. So they have to set the EU law as a like a kind of legal minimum, but they're allowed to have stricter regulations than that. So it would be a little bit misleading for any US companies, for example, to just assume that Europe is like a single country or that Asia is like a single country because there are just such huge differences between the various markets there. And I think that that is something that sometimes catches people unawares. Or, of course, also the fact that since Brexit, the UK is no longer such a practical staging post for US companies, especially because it makes it quite complicated if you're looking to expand into the rest of Europe. And if you're looking to be in the rest of, let's say, in the rest of Europe, being somewhere central, like, for example, in Austria, makes it quite practical because, you know, from here you can be at the Italian border in 3 hours. I can be in Germany in an hour. I can be in Prague in 3 hours, or I can be in Hungary in 3 hours if the traffic's good, you know. So we're pretty central here and we can get everywhere that we need to be. So I think that it's important to remember that both Europe and Asia are a patchwork of countries. You can't just generalize about them and look at the cultural stuff.
Absolutely. I forgot to do my three like icebreaker questions for you. So let's digress for a second. What got you into what you're doing?
um, as a linguist, I had to spend a year abroad from university. So I spent a year here in Austria. And I wanted to find a way that meant I could have another year in Austria having a really good time. And that way, I looked around at the local university, what postgraduate certificates they offered, and they offered a certificate in export and international business. And I thought, oh, that fits well with languages. Let's give that a go. And I did that, and everything just clicked, you know. So then I started out in export admin, which wasn't really quite my jam. It was a good grounding. I'm very grateful that I did it, but it wasn't really my jam. And then I got the opportunity to get into export sales and marketing as an area manager, and that was much more my thing. And the rest, as they say, is history. So
Oh, that's fantastic. So what do you like the most about what you do?
I love traveling and meeting new people. So I know that they often say you shouldn't employ a business development manager who has this huge focus on traveling. I wouldn't say that my main focus is on the traveling, but it is the part of the job that I enjoy the most. Going places and meeting people, even when they're places that other people don't necessarily want to go to because they think that they're too risky or they're too out of the way, then especially those places are the places that I enjoy going to. So yeah.
Oh, oh, very cool. Okay. And then conversely, what is the thing that you like the least about what you do?
All of the bureaucracy and the regulations, especially around exporting food and beverages. I spent 18 years in infant formula. And of course, the regulations around that are pretty close to, they're almost at pharmaceutical levels. And so that kind of regulatory thing sometimes drives me a little bit crazy. Yeah.
Yeah, I can see why. I mean, it's needed, obviously, but
Yeah.
um, it
You
still makes life
understand why
difficult.
it's needed, but you just don't enjoy the process.
No, I totally get that. Totally get that. Okay. So getting back to the other question. Okay, I'm sorry. Hang on a second. If I cut out, it's because my throat is doing weird things. How can businesses navigate complex regulatory frameworks and compliance issues in markets like China or the EU? Oh my goodness. I'm so sorry.
Um,
Especially for food and beverage companies.
yeah, I would say do the research up front. Bless you. Um, make sure that you do the research up front. Talk to colleagues in the food industry. I'm sure that there's almost no food or drink company who doesn't have another reference company that they could call and say to them, hey, if you're in China already, or if you're in the EU already, how did you manage this or how did you manage that? And the other thing is, of course, reach out to external experts. There is quite a lot of, there is actually quite a lot of free information out there or relatively cheap information out there through local chambers of commerce, through the what do you call it in the US? The trade
Oh,
organization,
the commercial
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 counselors, and so on.
services.
Yeah. And I think that is something that smaller companies especially often forget, that they have that, usually they have some kind of chamber of commerce membership, and they don't always fully utilize the resources that would be available there. And sometimes they offer quite specialized assistance for at least the first steps. And I would say do not underestimate the complexity of it and the fact that the devil is really in the details, and that it can, if you mess up on that part of it when you're first starting out, it can ruin your chances of ever getting back into that market, realistically speaking, because it can get you put on blacklists, especially if you're talking about, for example, Asian markets. If they think that you're trying to get in and you're trying to cheat them in some way, then they just will, you know, make sure
Um,
that, yeah.
yeah. Now, do they have Chamber of Commerces in the different cities in Europe the same as we tend to have them here in the US?
They do. I mean, for example, in Austria and Germany, or I think also in the UK, you have compulsory Chamber of Commerce membership, which is then a national organization, and there will be local branch offices in pretty much every city. I mean, even here, every district, there's a local Chamber of Commerce, and we're the next town has 5,000 people, yeah, but they have a Chamber of Commerce. So
Wow, that's good.
but
Okay.
you
Oh,
know,
that's nice to
it's a
hear.
small country, so we have to be we are a trading nation because the country is too small, the domestic market is too small to support so many companies if you don't export. So yeah.
But that's nice to have that mindset. I mean, clearly all of us here are in international and we identify with that. Um, but it's by choice. And so interesting that in Austria it's more like a necessity. Hmm.
I would say I heard yesterday this week I was at an event in Vienna that every I think 25% of Austria's tax volume comes from trading, and something like almost 60% of Austria's GDP comes from international. So, yeah, or
Oh, wow. Okay.
55% of Austria, and this province of Austria is like 60%. So, we are very internationally focused in the region.
You are definitely in the right place at the right time, which is good. Awesome. Okay. What should brands consider with regard to labeling, packaging, and localizing products for the diverse markets, whether it's into the EU or into Asia, which I know is diverse. They're all diverse within themselves, but
Again, do the research up front. And I would say that in the initial stages, see if you have the option to just put stickers on locally, um, so that you can collaborate with your distributor who probably knows how the labels need to look, who probably knows what the information on the labels need to be. I wouldn't trust a distributor 100% blindly. I would also go away and do my own research, but that also they can be a great source of information. And I would try and, if you're just in the phase of really testing a market, I would try and change as little as possible for the very beginning in order to see what the response to your products is, unless you have something about your product which you 100% know is not acceptable for the clients in a particular market. So if you know that consumers don't accept a certain ingredient, or that they find it, you know, if they find it offensive, some kind of picture that you otherwise would have in your packaging, then of course you need to change those things. But otherwise, for the beginning, I would always try and do as much investigation as I can, find out what the ideal situation would be, and then look at what I have now and see how little I can get away with in the first stages until I know really what I actually need to do in order to sell the right products in that market. Because in lots of cases, you think that you're going to be selling, I don't know, you're going to be selling apples, bananas, and pears. And in the end, you suddenly realize that the consumers in that market maybe want to have pineapple with strawberries, or, you know, they maybe want something completely different to what you would have thought would be your hero products for a particular market. And so before you dive into doing lots of localization of recipes and packaging, I would say to try and see if you can do a short test without changing too much, just putting stickers on the packaging, for example, that kind of thing.
Yeah, so you can do small batches of those, 100, 200, 500, whatever you need to get those on there, right? Hmm.
And for certainly for some markets, for
Yeah.
Korea, for example, um, you need to send, if you can import less than, I think it's 100 kilos of any particular item for the first 2 or 3 imports, then it kind of, you do one customs analysis right at the beginning for the product registration. But then if you do a couple of smaller imports, then they don't do a second analysis. Whereas if you go from doing a registration import through to do importing a whole container, for example, of 3 items, then they will also do full analysis on the second or on the third delivery. So if you can import, I think it's three times like a smaller quantity, then it means that you incur less costs and less stress of registration. Because I mean, in most countries, if they're looking to find something, it's like with tax if you go to if you have a problem with the IRS, if they want to find something in your tax, they will find something. And it's the same with most import authorities. If they really want to find something in your products or your labels or your paperwork, they can probably find something that they can at least delay your shipment with. And with foods, of course,
Mhm.
you can't afford to do that. So, yeah.
Okay. That very savvy advice. What are the key factors a brand should evaluate when deciding whether to use a distributor, an agent, or to build their own local presence in a foreign market?
I personally would say that if you are a small or a medium company who doesn't have too much experience in a market, then don't build or don't found your own entity in that market unless there is a very good strategic reason for you to do so. If you don't already have a sales track record there. And from that point on, the question as to whether you go with an agent or whether you go with a distributor, in some cases, is a little bit personal taste. Um, I personally usually would recommend smaller brands who are entering for the first time into a market to build the presence to go with a distributor, simply because it gives them the opportunity to benefit from that really local expertise and that network relationships, um, and to really leverage on that rather than having somebody who, as an agent, is possibly looking more for a quick sale rather than potentially a distribution partner who might be more willing to do the brand building. So I think it depends how your company is working, what kind of marketing budgets you have, and of course it always comes down to money at the end of the day. But to found an own entity for doing sales, marketing, not just the import, is always going to be a more expensive and risky operation if you have no prior knowledge and no prior track record in that market.
Doesn't an agent still have to help you find distribution? So doesn't that just like add another layer as it is?
It depends. I mean, there are agents who more or less act as distributors, but they're not doing the job on on their own dollar, as it were. So effectively, you are still bankrolling them up to a certain point. So there are agents within Europe who will do the import and who will sell into wholesale for you. Um, and they work on lower percentages than a distributor who imports on their own invoice at their own risk in their own name. Um, but from a cash flow perspective, it's not always the best thing for you, because if you sell directly to retail, for example, if you're selling from the US and your agent is putting you directly into retail, into Reva, they're putting you into Edeka, for example, you've still got to be able to service those you've still got to be able to service those accounts, and it's quite difficult from a long way away. Even from one side of Europe to the other, it's very difficult to service directly. In the past, I've worked with companies where they've wanted us to service directly their branches in Romania, which is,
Yeah.
realistically speaking, it's about 2 days. It's not even 2 full days, but it's a day and a half by truck from Austria or from Hungary. But
Mhm.
it's not practical if they're just wanting you to deliver 6 pieces or 2 cartons or something like that every couple of days. You need to have that presence of a warehouse and of somebody who's locally taking care of all of the marketing for you. And I think the best way to do that is to go with a distribution partner.
Definitely sounds like it. So if somebody does decide to go the distributor route, how do they establish and maintain trust with the distributors, especially in culturally distinct areas or markets like Korea or Southeast Asia?
The best way to do it is to go there and to spend some time with people and to, I know I sound a little bit like a broken record, but really to take the time up front as to what is valuable for that person, in the sense of, do you need to establish a relationship with them before you can actually start talking about business, as it is in most of Asia, that you need to sit down with people, you need to drink tea with them or coffee with them. If you're in Korea, you need to go and have lunch with them. Sometimes you also need to go and do karaoke with them, or you need to, you need to go beyond your own comfort zone, as it were. And also there's that question of, I think, I mean, especially the US, then having that kind of personal small talk at the beginning of a meeting feels a bit weird, I can imagine, for a lot of people. But at the end of the day, if you're wanting to do business in, especially in East Asia, then that is what you need to do. I mean, you don't have to tell them your deepest personal secrets, but maybe you want to tell them that you enjoy watching sport or something, which is basically it's not personal information, is it? So, but people are going to ask you questions. I mean, I've had people ask me in Asia quite openly, what do you earn? Or they'll ask you quite openly, do you have kids and are you married? And you know
Well, they
which
want
is
to get
quite
to know you,
unusual.
basically.
Yeah, they really want to know you before they actually get down to talking business. Whereas if you're in somewhere in Europe, of course it's important to build a relationship, but it's a much quicker process, and it's more task focused, so you can actually get down to discussing the business, and the way that you approach those business discussions will also form part of the basis of trust. And of course, eating and drinking is always going to be somehow part of the way of building relationships, because that's the way that humans work, isn't it? But I would say it's not quite as mission critical in most of Europe as it is in lots of parts of Asia.
Okay, interesting. Good to know. Excuse me. So, how can exporters identify red flags when they're vetting potential distributors or agents? What should they be watching out for?
I would say they need to watch out. They need to have a list up front, a checklist of things, of questions that they want to ask. They need to make sure that they're questioning what the values of the people that they're looking to work with as their distribution partners. Because if you have an importer who, for example, thinks it's quite normal to bribe customs officials, yeah, to take an extreme case, then for most companies, that is going to be a huge compliance red flag, um, that you don't want to work with. Or, of course, doing the regular financial type of checks of going to a company like Dun and Bradstreet, asking them for a report on a company and saying to a company up front, look, this is for our controlling department. Please just jump through the hoops for us. If they don't already have the details on you, they will give you a call. Please give them some details. I think there are lots of ways that you can go through and talk to people. I would say that one of the other points that I find is that companies often don't ask enough questions about how a distribution partner is going to run the pricing policy, because I believe that as a brand owner, you should also be part of that discussion. The pricing policy, how the brand building is going to take place. Some distributors want that to come 100% from the brand owner. Other distributors, they want to be a part of it because they want to have a say in how that is done in the market because they're the local experts. So depending on what you as a company feel most comfortable with and how your budgets are structured and how you feel about transferring money around the world for marketing purposes, where it might be a bit difficult to work out what they've actually used it for. You know, I mean, there's marketing and there's marketing of the yeah type. Then I think that you need to be clear for yourselves internally upfront what for you are the important factors and the important questions to ask. I mean, I think I have a blog post somewhere on my website which is like 55 questions or 50 more than 55 questions that you can ask a distributor up front, and probably not all of them are going to be relevant for every brand, but some of them will be. And I'm sure that every brand is going to have a couple of extra ones as well that are specific to their product or their particular set of company values or their owners' principles and so on.
Okay, that makes sense. Perfect. So, what is your advice for dealing with conflicts or underperformance when you're working with overseas partners?
um, if I'm working with European partners, then I will address it pretty directly. I mean, just how directly I address it depends who I'm talking to. If I'm talking to, let's say, Northern Europe, um, or even Southeastern Europe, then I'll talk about it very directly. Which sometimes, if you're talking Eastern Europe, then it can get quite loud. It can get, you know, a very robust kind of discussion, I would say. If I'm looking at addressing something in Asia, then it depends a little bit on how well I know the person that I'm talking to. If there's somebody, if it's a partner in China, for example, that I know quite well, probably in lots of cases, then I can also be very upfront and very direct about it. As long as it's not framed as a personal criticism of any one person, but that is put on the table in a way that is, you know, how can we solve this? We have this problem. We need to find a way forward. We need to manage this, rather than why did you do this or that. And so, but I think that there are markets in Southeast Asia specifically where the culture is still very, let's say, very indirect in the way that they like to express conflicts or criticisms. And so you do have to be very, very careful about the way that you put things forward so that nobody's losing face, so that nobody's getting upset and taking it personally, because you don't want to lose a contract because of a poorly thought through discussion opener.
But what happens when they really have made an egregious mistake, for example, and maybe it's cost you penalties or something like that? Um,
I mean, I would say it is always going to depend a little bit on what is the history you have with that partner, what is the relationship you have with that partner. But realistically speaking, you have to speak about it at some point in time. And it's better to do it in person than it is to do it in writing. I would always try for bigger conflicts to actually talk about them in an in-person meeting rather than to do it through a video call, or in writing especially is always open to misinterpretation, I would say. So
especially if there's a foreign language involved.
especially if there's a foreign language involved, and sometimes I think that, you know, the person who's in charge of the export sales in that market probably has quite a good idea as to how they can approach difficult situations or conflicts with that particular distribution partner. What often happens though is that if it's a really big problem and you've got the owner or you've maybe got the CEO who wants to come along, that they maybe don't have the same levels of cultural empathy. They just are like, we want to solve the problem. And if they're coming from a culture which is used to addressing critical issues very, very directly, then it can quickly, let's say, things can quickly get quite unpleasant with a partner, even more unpleasant than it actually needed to be. And I think that at the end of the day, most of us, if you have a conflict with a partner, your first idea is you want to solve it in a way that's a win-win for everybody, rather than to come in and treat them like little kids and just kind of, just grind them into dust and beat them into the ground, which sometimes you might feel like doing because they've really annoyed the hell out of you, but it's not a good idea for future relationships. And realistically speaking, most companies are not looking to burn bridges if they don't have to, because changing distribution partners is a really expensive exercise. So it's something not to be treated lightly.
That makes total sense. Especially when someone else has control of your inventory and other legal issues. So I totally see that.
I
So,
mean, that
so
is
the world,
that is one of the things that I think that if you're heading into export markets, you need to have a very good contract that has been checked by lawyers in both of the countries that are affected by the contract. Because most food and beverage companies that I know also have agreements in place that say if product registrations have to be carried out by an entity, a legal entity in the importing country, so you as a brand are not owning your product registrations, then what happens if you fall out with the import partner? So you might want to think about doing your product registrations legally through a lawyer's or an accountant's office who offer that kind of a service. There are people out there who do that. And also to have contract clauses in place that regulate exactly what happens to your stock if you end a contract with somebody. And it's much easier to negotiate those kind of horrible negative contract clauses at the beginning of the relationship when everybody's still happy with each other and you're still at the phase of going out for dinner and having karaoke and all of those kind of things and drinking together, rather than at the point in time when you're already in the middle of a conflict and you're trying to stop that import partner from just dumping all of your products onto the market and completely ruining your brand equity, before you can get another importer in place. So I think that that is something that companies do have to think about a little bit in advance. And that is one of the things about export, isn't it? That the time frames that you're looking at with a lot of moving pieces are quite long, and you really do have to look forward into the future and think what could happen and try and protect yourself as best you can.
that makes sense. So we're talking a lot about cultural understanding, which is clear it drives everything when you're exporting to a foreign to into a foreign market. Um, can you give an example of how important cultural understanding is when you're marketing consumer goods into Asia versus Europe and when it could make or break a deal?
Um, I think if you look, there are a lot of examples out there of brands who have made big mistakes. Especially, there are a lot of brands who've kind of made mistakes in the Chinese market. For example, I think Dolce and Gabbana have had some quite hardcore mistakes, repeated mistakes that have gone down very badly with Chinese consumers, where they had an ad a couple of years ago with a model who was eating a pizza with chopsticks, and it's just like, well, Chinese people don't eat pizza normally with chopsticks. They would pick it up in their hand as if they have a pizza, they would pick it up in their hand. Um, and even if they would eat it with chopsticks, is one thing. If a Chinese person says that, it's another thing. If you, as an international brand from outside, come along and use that as a marketing campaign, because that is just a bit weird and creepy, you know. Um, and I think probably the one of the most famous examples in Europe of consumer products that really went quite wrong was Walmart in Germany.
Really?
Walmart bought a German supermarket chain that had they had a reasonably solid market share. It wasn't huge, but they had a quite decent presence. And they didn't take care of all the legalities. So they were breaking labor laws. They were breaking all kinds of other laws around the way that they were running their business, which got them into hot water because they didn't want to do things like offer vacation time and offer maternity leave, which is mandatory in the EU. And they were trying to, let's say, impose Walmart company culture onto German employees and German consumers. They didn't want the cashier being cheery and talking to them. They just want, if I'm in the supermarket, just push the stuff through the till as fast as possible. Just don't talk to me, just get on with it. I mean, it's kind of become a cliche these days if you look on YouTube about German culture and supermarkets, especially Aldi. But at that time, at the beginning of the 2000s, it was quite a new thing. And Walmart, they also had greeters in the supermarkets. I don't know if Walmart in the States still has greeters at supermarkets,
I
but
don't know.
uh, um, at that time they had in the US, and so they tried it for Germany, and people were totally turned off by the idea that they were at the door of the supermarket and somebody was being cheerful and talking to them and telling them to have a good day, and they were just like and it just the whole let's say the whole ethos of the Walmart brand just kind of hit up against German culture. People were more interested in quality than having just very, very cheap, which Walmart thought that if they could offer something which was much cheaper than anything else on the market, that they would be able to gain market share. And that by having huge stores with lots of non-food products, that this would go down in Germany really, really well. And it didn't. And in the end, they pulled out of the market after about 5, 6 years, something like that. So, yeah, I think that that's probably one of the biggest cultural failures that I've seen in Europe of a US brand, certainly.
Wow. You'd think they would have researched some of that. Like, where were you when they needed you?
I would have
Hello.
taken the money. I mean,
You would have had them do the right thing, though. I mean, I can totally see. And it's very interesting how different things are because when I go shopping, like in Spain, for example, like I'm used to talking to people. I want eye contact, and doesn't always happen.
yeah,
So it's very different. Um, okay, so let's talk about languages. How do language barriers and differing negotiation styles affect international business relationships? Especially if somebody doesn't even speak the language. Like, how does that all work out?
I think I would say that language barriers are not as much of a barrier as people think they are, or at least not in the way that people think they are. Because realistically speaking, none of us speak all the languages of the world. Much as a linguist by training, it would be fantastic if I could speak all the language of the world. It would just be the best thing. But that's not a realistic expectation. But there are still many, many people out there in the international trade world who do business internationally. Um, and most of us who are here today have English as a first language, or at least as a second language. And I think it's always important to remember that the people that we're talking to might not have English as a first or even a second language. It might be their third or fourth language. And that to be very, very clear in the way that we express ourselves without using lots of sport analogies, without using lots of pop culture analogies to things that people may not have heard of or seen and be able to relate to. I think that that is something that's really important to do, as well as to have understanding if people express themselves clumsily or in a way that appears rude, that in most cases people are not trying to be rude, they just don't know how to express themselves. And I do feel that usually language is not that big a deal, but if it doesn't work at all, and if people for example, often in some places in Asia, for example, in Japan, top executives often really struggle with English, and it's often an assistant who has good language skills, but they're not very senior within the company. And so sometimes it doesn't appear such a big deal in the initial discussions that you're having, but the further you get into a relationship and you start to discuss more nuanced ideas, or you start to discuss more detailed concepts, then it can be more difficult to actually get your point across. And especially when it comes to things like contracts, then it is really worth investing, or for conflicts, it can be really worth investing in a good interpreter who also knows your industry specifics, because otherwise you can end up in a lot of, I've worked with interpreters before who've had no idea of the products that we were working in, and in the end it was actually easier to work with the executive who had, you know, really quite bad English but understood the business, rather than with somebody who had fluent English but had not the faintest clue about the actual business side of things, and who was just making things more and more complicated because they didn't understand the material of what we were talking about.
That's interesting. So where do you find interpreters that have experience? Like I know there's like, and there's members of the Global Chamber that, have interpreting businesses and things of that sort. So is that like one of the subcategories, people that have expertise, what in like consumer goods, or like what would they look in your world? What expertise would you be looking for in an interpreter?
I would be looking for somebody who had experience in consumer goods. Yeah, usually in food and beverage, maybe retail, depends on what kind of products I was looking at. But those would be the kind of interpreters that I was looking for. If I was looking to negotiate around a contract, I might look for somebody who's got more experience with the legal side of things.
And
So
it would be less industry agnostic at that point because the contract is the thing.
yeah, although, I mean, having had contracts before that were written by lawyers who had no idea about the food and beverage and retail industry, and you read through it, and I'm reading through it and thinking, you know, I don't understand this as a native speaker, so I don't know how any client of mine is going to understand it. And asking them to rephrase things because they choose terms that nobody in the industry would ever use. And I think that that is always an issue if you've got particular jargon, as it were, that belongs to your industry, and most industries do have, then you need to find either you have a list of that kind of jargon that you provide to people up front if you work a lot with interpreters, or you find an interpreter who's really specialized on that particular topic.
Yeah, that makes total sense. And even like within the same language, I know having worked with um, British companies, especially in the currency exchange world, when I read their brochures for the US market, I'm like, you can't use the word scheme because I know that means program where you are in the UK, but here a scheme is something kind of like nefarious, like you're trying to
Yeah.
sneak something by somebody, not a good thing.
Mm-hmm.
Or they would say, a bespoke solution. Well, most people here don't know what bespoke is. They would look for like tailor made or specifically made for you or things like that. And we all speak English, but even
Yeah.
from coast to coast, there's going to be differences in the vernacular.
Yeah. I mean, it's that what's the saying? Two countries divided by common language about the US and the UK, I think. That I don't know
Yeah,
whether it was
absolutely.
Churchill who said it, but yeah,
Yeah,
that's
that
the kind
just
of thing.
brilliant
I
when you think
mean,
about it.
realistically speaking, here in Austria, because it's, because it's so mountainous, you can have differences in language that's commonly used between one valley and the next. So,
Yeah, no, absolutely. I do have a few more questions, but we're getting like in that last, 10-15 minute region. So I want to open it up to see if anybody else has any questions first, or comments or whatever. You've got people like have you met Elizabeth before? Okay,
we've
because you
met
guys,
before.
there's definitely some synergy. And Doctor of Startups has a question, so go for it.
Well, it's not necessarily a question as much as sharing some experience on the distributor programming, how to filter. Let's use Aldi for an example. That you do some deep research to find out who the decision maker is for your particular product. Then you go to your distributor and say, who do you work with at Aldi's? And if it's not that name, that's not the distributor. So in other words, if you know the buyer and they don't, that's a distributor that's probably not going to fulfill what you need. And having the same conversation culturally and language, I tell the interpreters and the executive or buyer we were talking to, if I say something that's not clear, stop. Ask me again. Just smack me in the head and say, what does that mean? And it's surprising how they laugh, but then you can go on with the conversation on the same platform.
Yep.
Yeah, because
Especially in
sometimes people
especially in
are
Asia.
embarrassed. Yeah.
Yeah. Especially in Asia where people don't want to say that they didn't understand something or that they are not sure how to interpret something because they think they might lose face.
I would imagine. I was at an event once that was being interpreted by someone who was translating into Spanish. And when it wasn't my turn to speak, I was listening in on what she was saying because I'm bilingual. And I'm like, oh my goodness. Like I know a lot of people that could have done a better job and they're not professional interpreters. And so you just
Yeah.
never really know um, where it's all getting lost, like where words go to die, I guess. Because Um, definitely. Um, hmm. So I was going to ask you, um, with regard to adapting marketing strategies for social media platforms, um, like, are there any? I mean, we've all heard of different ones, I guess, for different regions, but which ones are unique to markets like China, Korea? Um, and would those same ones, could they be used in Europe, or are they all three completely distinct?
I would say they're fairly much distinct. If you're looking from the US into Europe, then probably your social media platforms are going to be the same platforms, but the actual focus and the mix of which platform is more important for which demographic and for which consumers is probably going to be different. Um, and when it comes to things like messaging, then it gets quite different. Europeans are tending to be using WhatsApp mostly. Um, and things like Facebook Messenger is not really very popular. I mean, people have it, but it's not what they would use day to day. If you move into Southeast Asia, then your Facebook, Instagram, Snapchat type marketing is all still an option. But again, the change is which are the focus platforms, and you start to have local platforms, especially when we start to talk about e-commerce, then you're starting to have local platforms that are having more influence and that are becoming more important. So, for example, if you're working in Southeast Asia, if you're in Thailand, for example, then you probably have to be doing marketing via Line because Line is what is used in Thailand, Indonesia, Taiwan, Japan for marketing, and every cafe has a QR code to join there or follow them online, and you can get coupons, etc. And of course, Korea also has their own platforms. If you're looking at things like Naver, and a few other platforms as well. And then, of course, you go to the Great Chinese Firewall, and once you go on the other side of the firewall, then pretty much I would say that is pretty much a unique ecosystem, which has a little bit of bleed into Taiwan, and it has a little bit of bleed into Singapore, Malaysia, where there's a number of Chinese speakers, but not so much outside of that area. I mean, you can have international versions of most of the Chinese apps. I've probably got 6 or 7 of them on my phone, but you don't get the full user experience as an international user that you would get if you downloaded from the Chinese App Store, as it were.
So, in those cases, you also have an orthographic disconnect. So do they offer like English versions or French versions or German versions? And how decent have you found those transliterations to be?
Um, they have English versions for sure. I've never tried to see if there's a German version. There might be a German. I don't know if there's a German version of WeChat, but there's an English version, which is pretty good. The translation on WeChat, sometimes if friends send me messages in Mandarin and it's beyond my basic Mandarin, I'll translate it. And if I can't get the translation, I'll just copy the Mandarin into Google and see. And normally the WeChat translate is actually better than Google as far as Mandarin is concerned. But that, their app internal translation is usually pretty good. And the same for most of the Chinese apps. Things like Alipay, the English version of the app is actually pretty good. It's when you then start using apps within the app, like if you go to a restaurant and they say to you, scan this QR code and you'll get the menu and you can make your order. And then it gets more difficult to get the translation of the menu if you don't understand enough to make the order directly in Chinese. Then it starts to get more complicated.
Oh my
With
gosh.
automatic translations, you have to kind of copy it out or something like that.
Okay, wow. That's intense. They have Alipay in the States as well, right?
Probably for mainland Chinese visitors. But for example, I have an international version of Alipay, so I can't use it outside of mainland China.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
Which is, it's actually quite frustrating because if you, for example, if you take the train from Shenzhen to Hong Kong, you cross the border and it's proper border crossing, full border crossing, even though it's still China or not, you know. And you get into Hong Kong and you've been used to the idea you can pay for everything with your phone and you need to buy a train ticket, but you can only buy a train ticket in cash. And the cash machine, the first cash machine after the border is behind the barriers where you already have to buy a ticket. So you have to buy a ticket in cash, but you have to also know that you either need cash or that there's a cash machine on the Shenzhen side that will dispense Hong Kong dollars. And otherwise you're stuck in this kind of, you're already in Hong Kong, but you don't have any Hong Kong cash. And there's no cash machine to give you cash before you've bought a ticket. And you can't buy a ticket because you need yeah.
It was like a movie I saw. What was that one with Tom Hanks? He's stuck in the airport. Was that Tom Hanks? Anyways, yeah, like that's the actual lifelike definition of a conundrum. What are you gonna do?
Yeah.
Okay, awesome. Okay, so we are getting close to the top of the hour, and I always like to end a minute or two early in case somebody has like an immediate meeting at the top of the next hour for whatever they're doing. So I wanted to thank everybody so much for joining us today, and thank you, Kathryn, for sharing your amazing knowledge. And we know who to go to when we're, in Europe and wanting to branch out to all these other places. You all are welcome to join us for our next Export Import Forum, which is usually the fourth Thursday of the month, but in November, it would have been Thanksgiving, and in December, it's the day after Christmas. So we just kind of found a midway point, and hence that was our meeting today. But the next one will be on January 23rd, which is the fourth Thursday of the month. And then in between, of course, check out the calendar of events on the Global Chamber website. There is always something going on sometime in the world. And if you're an insomniac, literally you can jump on something going on in Asia or Australia. You never ever need to feel like you're alone. So thank you again so much. And we'll let you know when the recording is out of this so that you can go back and listen to anything that you may have missed. And we'll also post that on the Global Chamber. I'll tag the Global Chamber when that comes out as well on LinkedIn. So it shall live on. And thank you all again. Have a great rest of the week and upcoming weekend.
Thank you,
Thanks for inviting me.
Kathryn. Thank you.